when 38-year-old vineyard owner Elena Vasquez pulled a stranded motorist from a raging flash flood during the most devastating storm Montana had witnessed in 50 years. She believed she was simply following the values her grandmother had instilled in her. But the enigmatic stranger she rescued that torrential night carried classified information that would summon the United States Air Force directly to Elena's remote estate, transform her struggling family winery into the center of a national security operation, and expose a military cover-up that had been buried in government files for over 3 decades. Before we uncover this extraordinary tale of courage, consequence, and hidden truth, let us know in the comments which state you're tuning in from tonight. And if stories of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances inspire you, make sure that subscribe button is pressed, because tomorrow's story will challenge everything you think you know about fate and coincidence. The September morning sun cast long golden shadows across Vasquez Vineyards as Elena stood among the withering grapevines, her worn leather boots crunching on the drought-hardened earth that had sustained her family for more than a century. The 400-acre estate nestled in Montana's Bitterroot Valley represented far more than agricultural investment. It was a living testament to the American dream, carved from wilderness by her great-great-grandfather Miguel, when he arrived from Andalusia in 1898, with nothing but determination and a canvas bag containing precious Tempranillo seeds. Now at 38, Elena found herself the reluctant guardian of a legacy that seemed determined to slip through her fingers like the morning mist that rose from Willow Creek each dawn. The ornate wooden sign at the vineyard's entrance, hand-carved by her grandfather Joaquin in 1967, bore the proud declaration Vasquez Vineyards, 1898, family-owned and operated. But the reality behind that weathered proclamation was far more precarious than any visitor could imagine. Elena's office, housed in the converted stone cellar that had once contained her great-grandfather's first wine press, resembled a battlefield of financial devastation. Mortgage statements, equipment loans, supplier invoices and tax notices created overlapping layers of obligation across every available surface. Bank correspondence formed towering stacks beside her grandfather's antique desk, each envelope containing numbers that told the same relentless story: declining wine sales, increased competition from corporate vineyards, equipment failures that cost more to repair than replace, and weather patterns that seemed increasingly hostile to traditional viticulture. The centerpiece of this financial catastrophe was a certified letter from Glacier National Bank, its corporate letterhead as cold and impersonal as winter frost on vineyard stakes. Final notice: foreclosure proceedings to commence October 15, 21 days to find $340,000, or lose everything her family had built across more than a century of Montana summers and winters. Elena's great-great-grandfather Miguel had purchased this land for $847 in 1898, paying in gold coins earned from 3 years of back-breaking work in the Butte copper mines. Her great-grandfather Roberto had expanded the vineyard during the Prohibition era, secretly maintaining the vines while publicly growing wheat and barley. Her grandfather Joaquin had modernized operations in the 1960s, installing irrigation systems and temperature-controlled fermentation tanks that made Vasquez wines competitive with California vintages. Her parents Maria and Eduardo had built the tasting room and gift shop that transformed the vineyard from working farm into tourist destination during the 1980s wine boom. Each generation had faced challenges: economic depressions, world wars, prohibition, changing consumer tastes, corporate competition, and each had found ways to adapt, survive, and pass the legacy forward. Elena was the first Vasquez in 5 generations who might fail in that fundamental responsibility. The morning ritual she had performed since childhood, walking the vineyard rows with a cup of her grandmother's strong coffee, checking vine health and grape development, had become a daily confrontation with mounting problems she couldn't solve through hard work alone. The Tempranillo vines her great-great-grandfather had planted from Spanish seeds showed stress from irregular rainfall patterns. The Cabernet Sauvignon section her father had expanded in the 1990s struggled with soil conditions that seemed to change each year. The experimental Pinot Noir vines she had grafted during her optimistic period after graduating from UC Davis with a degree in viticulture and enology produced beautiful grapes that couldn't compete with Oregon wines selling for half the price. Elena had tried everything conventional wisdom recommended for struggling agricultural businesses. She had diversified into wedding venues and corporate retreats. She had upgraded her wine-making equipment with loans that now added to her debt burden. She had hired marketing consultants who promised to expand her customer base through social media campaigns and wine club subscriptions. She had participated in every regional wine festival, agricultural fair, and tourism promotion within a 200-mile radius. None of it had generated enough revenue to offset the fundamental challenge facing family wineries throughout the American West, competing against massive corporate operations with unlimited capital, economies of scale, and distribution networks that small producers couldn't match. Vasquez wines were superior in quality to many corporate brands. Wine competition judges consistently awarded them gold and silver medals, but quality alone couldn't overcome the retail dynamics that favored large volume producers. The financial pressures crushing Vasquez Vineyards were complicated by grief that Elena had never fully processed. Her brother Carlos, 3 years older and her closest childhood companion, had been killed by an improvised explosive device during his second deployment to Afghanistan in 2019. The official army notification described his death as occurring during routine patrol operations near Kandahar, language so clinical and impersonal that it seemed to diminish the vibrant, passionate person Carlos had been. Carlos had planned to return to the vineyard after his military service. During his brief leave periods, he had talked excitedly about modernizing their marketing strategies, expanding into organic certification, and developing wine varietals specifically adapted to Montana's unique climate conditions. His death hadn't just cost Elena her brother, it had eliminated her planned business partner and the financial assistance his army benefits would have provided. The folded American flag from Carlos's funeral still occupied the place of honor on the mantelpiece in the main house, positioned between photographs spanning 5 generations of Vasquez family members who had called the Bitterroot Valley home. Elena often found herself talking to Carlos's photograph during difficult moments, asking for guidance she knew would never come, seeking comfort in memories that intensified her sense of isolation. Carlos had possessed the kind of natural leadership and infectious optimism that made challenges seem surmountable. When they were children, he had organized elaborate games and adventures that transformed routine farm chores into exciting quests. When they were teenagers, he had encouraged Elena's interest in science and technology, helping her set up experiments to test soil conditions and vine genetics. When she had struggled through her first year at UC Davis, feeling overwhelmed by the academic rigor and intimidated by classmates from wealthy California wine families, Carlos had driven 8 hours to visit her, bringing homemade cookies from their grandmother and the encouragement she needed to persevere. His absence created a void that went beyond emotional support. Elena had always assumed that maintaining the family legacy would be a shared responsibility, that the weight of 5 generations would be distributed between siblings who complemented each other's strengths. Carlos had been the natural salesman, comfortable talking with customers and building relationships with distributors. Elena excelled at the technical aspects of winemaking, but struggled with the interpersonal demands of running a hospitality business. Montana weather had always been unpredictable, characterized by sudden temperature changes, unexpected storms, and seasonal variations that challenged even experienced agricultural operations. Elena's grandfather had taught her to read atmospheric signs, cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, that provided more reliable weather prediction than television meteorologists, who focused on urban population centers and rarely understood the unique conditions affecting mountain valleys. But the climate patterns Elena had learned from her grandfather no longer seemed to apply. Summers arrived earlier and lasted longer, creating drought conditions that stressed vineyard irrigation systems designed for traditional seasonal cycles. Winters brought ice storms and temperature fluctuations that damaged vine root systems. Spring rains either failed to materialize or arrived with destructive intensity that caused erosion and flooding. On September 18th, the National Weather Service issued warnings that made even long-time Montana residents reconsider their evening plans. A massive storm system, fed by unusual atmospheric conditions over the Pacific Northwest, was moving inland with unprecedented moisture content and wind speeds that meteorologists described using terms like historic, unprecedented, and potentially catastrophic. Emergency management officials in Ravalli County held a press conference recommending that residents in rural areas prepare for flash flooding, extended power outages, and potential evacuation orders. The storm system showed characteristics typically associated with tropical hurricanes, despite developing over continental landmass hundreds of miles from any ocean. Computer weather models couldn't agree on the storm's likely path or intensity, suggesting atmospheric conditions beyond their predictive capabilities. Elena spent the afternoon implementing emergency protocols her grandfather had developed during his 70 years of Montana farming. She moved valuable wine inventory from the ground-level storage areas to elevated positions in the stone cellar. She secured outdoor equipment, checked generator fuel levels, and inspected the drainage systems around buildings that had been constructed to handle normal seasonal flooding, but had never been tested by extreme weather events. The vineyard occupied a natural basin surrounded by forested foothills, a geographical feature that created ideal growing conditions during normal weather, but potentially dangerous water accumulation during severe storms. Willow Creek, which normally meandered peacefully through the southern edge of the property, had a documented history of transforming into a raging torrent during heavy rainfall, capable of carrying away livestock, equipment, and unwary humans who underestimated its power. Elena's nearest neighbor, Tom Bradley, had operated a cattle ranch 2 miles upstream for more than 7 decades. His property included weather monitoring equipment installed by the National Weather Service, making him the unofficial meteorologist for their remote section of the Bitterroot Valley.
Tom called Elena around 4 p.m., concern evident in his weathered voice, despite his reputation for understated communication. "Elena, I've been watching the atmospheric pressure readings all afternoon, and I've never seen anything like what's heading our way. The weather service is using terminology I've heard maybe twice in my lifetime. You need to take this storm seriously. Do you have somewhere you can go if conditions become dangerous?" Elena appreciated Tom's concern. He had been her family's neighbor and unofficial advisor since before she was born, but leaving the vineyard wasn't a realistic option. She had 30 head of cattle in pastures that would need monitoring during severe weather. Critical winemaking equipment required climate-controlled conditions that could be disrupted by power outages. Temperature-sensitive wine inventory worth more than her annual income was stored in facilities that needed constant supervision. Besides, the Vasquez family had weathered Montana storms for over a century. The original stone buildings had been constructed using techniques Miguel had learned from Spanish masons, designed to withstand weather conditions that would destroy conventional wooden structures. The drainage systems Roccoin had engineered in the 1950s had handled every flood event in living memory. Elena would trust in the accumulated wisdom of 5 generations rather than abandon the property during its hour of greatest need. By 6 p.m., the western sky had transformed into something that belonged in apocalyptic paintings rather than the pastoral Bitterroot Valley. Layers of clouds stacked upon each other in formations that seemed to defy meteorological physics, ranging in color from deep purple to an ominous yellow-green that made the approaching darkness feel premature and threatening. Lightning flickered continuously within the cloud mass, creating an eerie illumination that cast shifting shadows across the vineyard rows. Elena's cattle gathered near the barn with instinctive awareness of approaching danger, their usual evening grazing replaced by nervous clustering and frequent glances toward the darkening sky. Even the vineyard's resident wildlife seemed to sense impending catastrophe. Normally active birds had disappeared entirely, while small mammals moved with urgent purpose toward whatever shelter they could find. The storm arrived with violence that exceeded every prediction and challenged Elena's faith in the defensive systems her family had constructed over generations. What began as heavy rain at 7:30 p.m. had escalated by 8:15 into a meteorological assault that transformed the familiar landscape into an alien environment where normal rules of cause and effect seemed suspended.
Wind gusts that the Weather Service would later measure at 78 miles per hour transformed Elena's carefully tended grapevines into a writhing sea of green and brown, with vine stakes snapping and trellis wires singing in harmonics that could be heard over the storm's general cacophony. Rain fell with such intensity that visibility dropped to less than 20 feet, making the vineyard's main buildings invisible from positions just beyond the front gate. Elena had experienced severe weather before. Montana's reputation for harsh conditions wasn't based on urban legend, but nothing in her 38 years had prepared her for the primal fury now unleashing itself across her family's land. Lightning strikes illuminated the valley in strobing snapshots that revealed a landscape transformed into something from a disaster film. Trees bent beyond their breaking points, horizontal rain that moved like solid sheets of water, and Willow Creek metamorphosed from a gentle waterway into a chocolate-brown torrent that had already overflowed its banks and was creeping toward the vineyard's lower sections. She monitored the storm's progress from the main house, built in 1924 using stone quarried from the surrounding hills and timber cut from the property's own forests. The structure had weathered 9 decades of Montana storms, but Elena could feel it responding to wind forces unlike anything in its architectural memory. Windows rattled in their frames, doors strained against their latches, and the heavy wooden beams that supported the roof groaned with sounds that spoke of structural limits being tested. At 8:47 p.m., Elena heard something that cut through the storm's overwhelming audio landscape, the distinctive sound of a car engine revving desperately, accompanied by the high-pitched whine of tires spinning without gaining traction. The sounds came from the direction of County Road 47, the 2-lane highway that provided the only vehicular access to this section of the valley. Elena grabbed binoculars and pressed her face against the kitchen window, but the combination of darkness, horizontal rain and condensation on the glass made detailed observation impossible. The engine sounds continued, growing more desperate with each passing minute, punctuated by what might have been a car horn, though the wind's howling made it difficult to distinguish artificial sounds from the storm's own varied chorus. County Road 47 crossed Willow Creek approximately half a mile from the vineyard's main gate, using a concrete bridge that Elena's grandfather had helped design in 1963. During normal conditions, the crossing was routine and safe. During flood conditions, the bridge became a bottleneck where rushing water created dangerous hydraulic effects that could trap vehicles or sweep them downstream. Elena's rational mind urged caution. Venturing into the storm to assist an unknown motorist would put her own life at risk without guarantee that she could provide meaningful help. The smart decision was to wait until morning, contact emergency services, and deal with whatever tragedy had occurred through proper channels that didn't involve additional casualties. But Elena's grandmother had raised her according to principles that transcended personal safety calculations. Cuando alguien necesita ayuda, tú ayudas. No hay más que pensar sobre eso. Abuela Carmen had repeated throughout Elena's childhood. When someone needs help, you help. There's nothing more to think about. Elena's storm emergency kit included waterproof clothing designed for Montana's harshest conditions, high-powered LED flashlights with fully charged batteries, climbing rope rated for rescue operations, and a first aid kit comprehensive enough to handle serious injuries. The gear seemed woefully inadequate as she prepared to venture into conditions that had already demonstrated their ability to uproot century-old trees and transform familiar terrain into hazardous obstacles. She wrote a brief note explaining her intentions and left it on the kitchen table, weighted down by a heavy ceramic mug her grandfather had made during his pottery phase in the 1970s. If something happened to her, search teams would at least understand why they had found her body somewhere between the house and County Road 47. Stepping outside was like entering a war zone where the atmosphere itself had become weaponized. Wind gusts strong enough to stagger a full-grown adult alternated with brief lulls that provided false hope before the next assault arrived. Rain fell with such force that breathing required conscious effort to avoid inhaling water instead of air. Lightning strikes occurred frequently enough to create continuous low-level thunder that Elena felt in her chest as much as heard with her ears. The walk to County Road 47 normally required 10 minutes of pleasant strolling through vineyard rows and along the gravel path that connected the main buildings to the property's entrance gate. Tonight the journey became a 30-minute battle against atmospheric forces that seemed determined to prevent her from reaching whatever emergency was unfolding at the creek crossing. Elena used fence posts and familiar landmarks to navigate, checking her compass repeatedly as terrain she had known since childhood became alien and potentially dangerous. The vineyard's carefully maintained paths had transformed into temporary streams carrying runoff from the surrounding hills. Grapevines she had tended since adolescence thrashed in the wind like living creatures in pain, their normally orderly rows reduced to chaos that made navigation by visual reference nearly impossible. What Elena discovered at Willow Creek Crossing exceeded her worst expectations and confirmed her decision to venture into the storm despite obvious personal risks. A dark blue SUV with Colorado license plates had attempted to cross the flooded bridge just as the creek reached peak fury. The vehicle was now angled sideways in the rushing water, pinned against the bridge's concrete supports with creek water flowing through its partially open windows at a rate that suggested complete submersion was only minutes away. The SUV's headlights still functioned, creating twin beams that illuminated the churning flood water and revealed the true power of what Willow Creek had become. What normally carried maybe 3 inches of clear water now moved thousands of gallons per minute in a brown torrent carrying debris that ranged from small branches to entire tree trunks. The sound was deafening, a combination of rushing water, grinding rocks and the metallic protest of the vehicle's undercarriage being scraped against concrete and stone. Someone was still inside the trapped SUV. The driver was a woman perhaps in her early 50s, with shoulder-length dark hair streaked with premature gray and an expression that combined obvious concern with remarkable professional composure. Despite being trapped in a situation that would justify panic in most people, she appeared to be methodically assessing her circumstances and developing an action plan based on available options rather than emotional response. Elena's first priority was establishing communication over the storm's overwhelming noise. She positioned herself as close to the trapped vehicle as safety allowed and used her most powerful flashlight to signal the driver, sweeping the beam in deliberate patterns that indicated human presence and rescue intentions. The woman responded immediately, rolling down her driver's side window despite the obvious risk of allowing more water into the vehicle. "Can you hear me?" she called, her voice somehow carrying over the creek's roar with the kind of projection that suggested military or emergency services training. "I can hear you," Elena shouted back, impressed by the stranger's apparent calm in circumstances that would terrify most civilians. "Are you injured? Can you get out of the vehicle?" "I'm not injured, but I need to retrieve something from the back seat before I can abandon the vehicle," the woman replied, gesturing toward what appeared to be a metal briefcase secured behind the driver's position. Elena studied the SUV's situation with the kind of rapid assessment skills her grandfather had taught her for evaluating mechanical problems under pressure. The vehicle was wedged against the bridge supports by water pressure that was likely increasing as upstream rainfall continued adding to Willow Creek's flow. The driver's door was positioned upstream, meaning any attempt to exit from that side would require fighting against the current's full force. The passenger side was partially sheltered by the SUV's position, but reaching it would require the driver to maneuver across the interior, while the vehicle was being shaken by hydraulic forces. "Ma'am, whatever is in that case, it's not worth your life," Elena called, recognizing the universal human tendency to risk everything for possessions that seemed irreplaceable. "This vehicle could be swept downstream at any moment. You need to get out now."
The trapped woman looked directly at Elena with an intensity that cut through the chaos surrounding them, her eyes reflecting intelligence and determination that suggested this wasn't someone prone to poor judgment or panic-driven decisions. "I understand your concern, and I appreciate the risk you've taken to help me," the stranger replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "But what's in this case could prevent deaths, potentially many deaths. I need 60 seconds to secure it, and then I'll be ready for extraction." Elena had participated in various rescue operations during her adult life. Hikers caught in sudden mountain weather changes, tourists whose vehicles had broken down on remote Forest Service roads, neighbors dealing with agricultural accidents or medical emergencies that were part of rural Montana's challenging realities. But she had never encountered someone who maintained such focused determination while facing immediate mortal danger. The woman's reference to preventing death suggested contents far more significant than typical personal possessions. Elena found herself making split-second judgments about character and credibility under circumstances that allowed no time for extended evaluation. The stranger's composure, her obvious intelligence, and her willingness to risk her life for whatever the briefcase contained suggested someone involved in matters of genuine importance. Elena's climbing rope was designed for mountain rescue operations with a braking strength of 9,800 pounds and dynamic stretch characteristics that helped absorb impact forces during falls or sudden loading. She secured one end to the bridge's concrete railing, using a figure-8 knot her brother Carlos had taught her during their teenage rock climbing adventures, then tested the anchor point with her full body weight, plus additional stress to ensure it would hold under emergency conditions. Working her way into Willow Creek required every technique she had learned during years of outdoor recreation in Montana's unforgiving environment. The water's power was stunning. What appeared to be knee-deep flow from the bridge proved to be a torrent capable of sweeping away anything not firmly anchored to immovable objects. Without the safety rope, Elena would have been carried downstream within seconds, becoming another casualty rather than a rescue resource. The current's strength made normal swimming impossible, requiring Elena to use a combination of rope work and tactical positioning to maintain contact with the trapped SUV, while avoiding being crushed between the vehicle and bridge supports by hydraulic forces that shifted unpredictably with changes in water flow and debris accumulation. The stranger had somehow maneuvered herself into the SUV's backseat area, and was working with what appeared to be a complex locking mechanism on the metal briefcase. Elena had observed earlier, even from her position in the floodwater, Elena could see official government markings on the case's surface, federal agency seals, alphanumeric classification codes, and warning labels that indicated contents requiring special security protocols. "Ready?" Elena yelled, though the question was largely rhetorical since both women understood that timing was critical, and opportunities for safe extraction would only become more limited as the flood continued rising. "Ready?" the stranger confirmed, having secured the briefcase with some kind of waterproof harness system that would allow her to carry it during the rescue without requiring use of her hands. Getting someone out of a vehicle that's being pushed and rotated by thousands of gallons of rushing water requires coordination that's difficult to achieve under ideal circumstances. In a lightning storm with visibility near zero, and communication limited to shouted words that might not be heard over the creek's roar, the operation becomes an exercise in trust, instinct and shared commitment to success despite overwhelming odds. Elena positioned herself as close to the SUV as possible while maintaining her grip on the safety rope, then extended her free hand toward the trapped driver. The plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. The woman would push herself through the driver's side window opening at precisely the moment when a surge of floodwater shifted the vehicle's position, using the current's power to assist rather than hinder her escape. "On my count," Elena called. 3, 2, 1, go. The extraction worked better than either woman had dared hope, though success required split-second timing and physical coordination that left no margin for error. The stranger pushed herself through the window opening just as a particularly powerful surge of water shifted the SUV several feet downstream, creating a momentary reduction in current pressure on the driver's side. Elena's rope held under the sudden additional load. The woman's grip was firm and decisive, and together they managed to work their way back to solid ground just as the abandoned vehicle broke free from the bridge supports and disappeared into the darkness downstream. Elena's kitchen had never felt more welcoming than it did when she and her unexpected guest finally stumbled through the door, both soaked to the skin and shaking from a combination of cold exposure and adrenaline overload. Elena immediately began implementing the hospitality protocols her grandmother had established for emergency situations: hot coffee, warm towels, dry clothing, and the kind of comfort food that helped people recover from traumatic experiences.
"I'm Elena Vasquez," she said once both women were wearing dry clothes and holding steaming mugs of the strong coffee her grandmother had taught her to make using techniques passed down from Spanish ancestors.
"Doctor."
"Rebecca Thorne," the stranger replied, her handshake firm and confident despite the evening's ordeal. "And before you ask what a Colorado resident was doing driving through rural Montana during what amounts to an inland hurricane, I need you to understand that what happened tonight wasn't coincidence. I was specifically looking for you, Elena Vasquez." Elena paused with her coffee mug halfway to her lips, processing information that seemed to belong in a suspense novel rather than her kitchen on a storm-lashed September evening. "Looking for me specifically? I don't understand. We've never met, have we, Doctor?" Thorne gestured toward the metal briefcase that had nearly cost both women their lives, which now sat on Elena's kitchen table like an artifact from a world she didn't recognize. Its surface bore an array of official government seals, classification markings, and warning labels that suggested contents both valuable and potentially dangerous. "I'm a former analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency, Doctor," Thorne explained, her tone shifting to the kind of professional precision that suggested someone accustomed to briefing senior officials on matters of national security. "I retired from active service 3 years ago, but I've maintained certain responsibilities related to ongoing investigations of military procurement fraud and unauthorized weapons transfers." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied any mention of military service, a physical response she had never fully overcome since receiving notification of her brother's death in Afghanistan. "Dr. Thorne, I appreciate that you have important work, but I don't understand what any of this has to do with me or why you would risk your life driving through a storm to reach someone you've never met." The older woman leaned forward, her expression combining genuine sympathy with unmistakable urgency. "Elena, what's in this briefcase relates directly to your brother Carlos, your family's property, and events that occurred during his final deployment to Afghanistan in 2019. Events that led to his death and the subsequent cover-up of military crimes that have continued for 4 years. Elena's hands began trembling as she set down her coffee mug, the simple ceramic suddenly feeling too heavy to hold steadily. The official version of Carlos's death, killed by an improvised explosive device during routine patrol operations, had never satisfied her questions about the circumstances. But military officials had provided no additional details, despite her repeated requests for information that might help her understand how and why her brother had died. Dr. Thorne, my brother was killed in a random attack by insurgents. The army provided a full briefing about the incident. There was no conspiracy, no cover-up, just the tragic reality of military service in a combat zone. Rebecca Thorne's expression softened with the kind of compassion that suggested someone who had delivered difficult news to families before, someone who understood the difference between official explanations and complicated truth. Elena, what if I told you that Carlos wasn't killed in a random IED explosion? What if his death was directly connected to his investigation of unauthorized weapons sales to Afghan militia groups, sales that were generating millions of dollars in untraceable revenue for certain military contractors and corrupt officials within the Pentagon procurement system? The kitchen seemed to shift around Elena as she processed implications that threatened to rewrite everything she thought she understood about her brother's service and death. Are you telling me that Carlos was murdered because he discovered something? I'm telling you that your brother was a genuine American hero who died attempting to protect both American soldiers and Afghan civilians from weapons that were being sold to their enemies by people sworn to defend them. Dr. Thorne replied, placing her hand on the briefcase's electronic locking mechanism. And I'm telling you that the evidence he collected, evidence that disappeared after his death, and was presumed destroyed, has finally been recovered. Elena looked around her kitchen, taking inventory of the familiar surroundings that suddenly felt insufficient to contain the magnitude of what Dr. Thorne was suggesting. Family photographs spanning 5 generations smiled down from walls and shelves, documenting the American dream her ancestors had pursued through honest work and legitimate struggle. Her current financial problems, serious as they were, seemed simple compared to revelations about murder, conspiracy, and government corruption. What does any of this have to do with my vineyard? With me personally, Dr. Thorne smiled for the first time since Elena had pulled her from the floodwater, though the expression conveyed grim satisfaction rather than happiness. Carlos didn't just document the weapons sales and identify the people responsible, Elena. He also traced how some of the illegal profits were being laundered through legitimate businesses, including real estate purchases in remote areas where evidence could be hidden and operations could be conducted without scrutiny. Elena felt the world shifting beneath her feet as connections began forming between abstract concepts and concrete reality. You're saying that someone used money from illegal arms sales to buy property in Montana. I'm saying that certain individuals involved in the weapons trafficking conspiracy purchased land adjacent to your family's vineyard specifically because they needed a remote location to conduct activities they couldn't risk in more populated areas. And I'm saying that Carlos figured out their plan before they eliminated him to protect their operation. Outside, lightning continued flickering across the Bitterroot Valley, but the storm's fury was beginning to exhaust itself against the mountains that surrounded Elena's ancestral home. Inside her kitchen, however, a different kind of electrical tension was building, the charge that accumulates when long-buried truths finally approach the surface and demand acknowledgement regardless of their inconvenience or danger. Dr. Thorne began entering a complex numeric sequence into her briefcase's digital locking system, each keystroke sounding unnaturally loud in the kitchen's sudden quiet. Elena, in approximately 2 minutes, you're going to understand why a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst drove through the worst storm in Montana's recent history to find you personally. You're going to learn the real reason your brother died in Afghanistan. And you're going to discover that saving my life tonight was just the first chapter of a story that will require more courage than you currently know you possess. The briefcase lock disengaged with a metallic click that seemed to echo through the kitchen like a gunshot. Elena Vasquez, vineyard owner and struggling entrepreneur, was about to become something she had never imagined. A key witness in a military conspiracy that had cost her brother his life and now threatened to reshape her understanding of everything she thought she knew about family justice, and the price of speaking truth to power in a world where some truths were worth killing to protect. The storm outside was ending. The storm inside Elena's life was just beginning. The metallic click of the briefcase lock disengaging seemed to reverberate through Elena's kitchen with unnatural intensity, as if the simple mechanical sound carried weight beyond its physical properties. Dr. Rebecca Thorne's fingers moved with practiced precision across the case's contents, organizing documents and materials with the kind of systematic approach that suggested someone accustomed to handling classified information under pressure. What emerged from the briefcase transformed Elena's understanding of her brother's military service and death in ways that no amount of preparation could have cushioned. The first item Dr. Thorne extracted was a photograph of Carlos in full combat gear, but not the kind of standard military portrait Elena had seen before. This image showed her brother examining what appeared to be a sophisticated weapons cache, his expression focused and professional, as he documented serial numbers and manufacturer markings on equipment that looked far more advanced than anything she had associated with Afghan insurgent operations. This photograph was taken by Carlos during a raid on a Taliban weapons depot near Kandahar in March 2019. Dr. Thorne explained, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering an intelligence briefing. What made this particular operation significant wasn't what your brother's unit found, but what they recognized: American-manufactured weapons with serial numbers that traced back to legitimate military contracts, but which had somehow ended up in enemy hands through channels that bypassed all official transfer protocols. Elena studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the professional soldier documenting evidence with the laughing young man who had taught her to drive a tractor when she was 12 years old. Carlos's expression in the image suggested someone who understood the implications of what he was documenting, someone who recognized that the weapons cache represented more than simple battlefield recovery. Dr. Thorne placed a second photograph beside the first, showing Carlos with 2 other soldiers. Elena didn't recognize. All 3 examining documents spread across what appeared to be a makeshift field table. Your brother wasn't just an infantry soldier, Elena. The army had identified his aptitude for investigation and analysis, particularly his ability to spot patterns and inconsistencies that others missed. They assigned him to a specialized unit focused on tracking weapons flows and identifying corruption in military supply chains.
The revelation that Carlos had been involved in investigative work rather than routine patrol operations forced Elena to reconsider everything she thought she understood about his final deployment. The official notifications had described him as a member of standard infantry operations, killed during routine security duties. Learning that he had actually been investigating military corruption cast his death in an entirely different light. Dr. Thorne, if Carlos was investigating weapons trafficking, why wasn't this mentioned in any of the official reports? Why did the army tell our family he died during routine patrol operations? Rebecca Thorne's expression darkened with what appeared to be a combination of anger and professional frustration. Because the investigation your brother was conducting had begun uncovering connections between the unauthorized weapons transfers and certain individuals within the military procurement system, individuals with enough influence to ensure that inconvenient questions were buried along with the people asking them. The older woman extracted a thick folder from the briefcase, its contents secured with multiple classification stamps and warning labels that Elena had only seen in movies about government conspiracies. What Carlos discovered went far beyond simple theft or black market sales. He identified a systematic operation involving the deliberate diversion of American military equipment to Afghan militia groups, with profits from those sales being laundered through American businesses and real estate investments. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with her still damp clothing from the storm rescue. You're saying that American military officials were deliberately selling weapons to our enemies? I'm saying that certain individuals within the military-industrial complex were using the chaos and lack of oversight in Afghanistan to generate enormous profits by selling American weapons to the highest bidders, regardless of whether those buyers were allies, enemies, or somewhere in between. Dr. Thorne replied, opening the folder to reveal documents that looked like financial records, shipping manifests, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. The scope of what Dr. Thorne was describing challenged Elena's fundamental assumptions about military service and national security. Carlos had enlisted in the army because he believed in protecting American interests and helping Afghan civilians build a better future. Learning that he had been killed while investigating American officials who were profiting from the very conflict he had volunteered to help resolve added layers of betrayal to his death that Elena struggled to process. Dr. Thorne spread several documents across Elena's kitchen table, transforming the familiar domestic space into something resembling a law enforcement incident room. The papers contained information that would have seemed abstract and bureaucratic under normal circumstances, but which took on sinister significance when explained as evidence of military corruption that had cost American lives. This shipping manifest shows a consignment of M4 carbines, night vision equipment, and communications gear officially destined for Afghan National Army units in Helmand Province. Dr. Thorne explained, pointing to a document that looked like routine military paperwork. However, your brother's investigation revealed that this equipment never reached its intended recipients. Instead, it was diverted to militia groups with known connections to Taliban operations. Elena studied the manifest, trying to understand how official-looking documents could mask criminal paperwork appeared legitimate, complete with appropriate signatures, serial numbers, and routing information that suggested normal military logistics operations. How could Carlos tell that these weapons were diverted? This documentation looks official to me. Dr. Thorne smiled grimly. the expression of someone who had spent years untangling bureaucratic deceptions. Your brother had developed contacts within the Afghan National Army units that were supposed to receive the... When he followed up to assess how American equipment was being utilized in the field, he discovered that entire consignments had never arrived. The Afghan soldiers were still using outdated equipment while American weapons with matching serial numbers were being recovered from Taliban positions.
The systematic nature of the deception Dr. Thorne was describing suggested coordination and planning that went far beyond opportunistic theft. Elena was beginning to understand that Carlos hadn't stumbled across isolated incidents of corruption, but had uncovered an organized operation involving multiple participants at various levels of the military hierarchy. This financial record shows payments from a Cayman Islands account to several American businesses, including real estate companies, agricultural operations, and construction firms. Dr. Thorne continued, indicating another document. The amounts match the estimated profits from diverted weapons sales, and the timing corresponds with Carlos's investigation timeline. Elena examined the financial records, noting business names she didn't recognize, but locations that seemed familiar. Several of the American companies listed appeared to be based in Montana, including agricultural operations in counties adjacent to the Bitterroot Valley, where her family's vineyard was located. Dr. Thorne, some of these businesses are located near my property. Are you suggesting that money from illegal weapons sales was being invested in Montana agriculture? The older woman's expression became more intense, as if Elena was finally asking the questions that led to the heart of the conspiracy. I'm suggesting that the people responsible for the weapons diversions needed ways to launder their profits through legitimate American businesses, and that rural agricultural operations provided ideal opportunities for large cash investments that wouldn't attract regulatory scrutiny. The implications of what Dr. Thorne was revealing extended far beyond Carlos's investigation and death. If illegal weapons profits were being laundered through Montana businesses, it meant that Elena's community had been unknowingly infiltrated by people whose wealth came from activities that had cost American lives and prolonged the Afghan conflict. But what does any of this have to do with me specifically? Why did you risk your life to find me rather than taking this information to federal authorities or the media? Thorne reached into the briefcase again, this time extracting what appeared to be a small recording device and several photographs that showed aerial views of rural Montana properties. Because your brother's final communications indicated that he had identified specific locations where evidence of the money laundering operation was being stored, and because one of those locations is adjacent to your family's vineyard. Elena stared at the aerial photographs Dr. Thorne had placed before her, recognizing the familiar landscape of the Bitterroot Valley from a perspective she had never seen before. The images appeared to have been taken from military aircraft or satellites, showing details of property boundaries, building locations, and land use patterns with clarity that suggested sophisticated surveillance equipment. This photograph shows your vineyard and the surrounding properties, Dr. Thorne explained, pointing to an image that clearly depicted Vasquez Vineyards' distinctive layout of vine rows, the stone buildings constructed by Elena's ancestors, and Willow Creek meandering through the southern section of the property. And this shows the property immediately to your north, which was purchased in 2018 by a company called Mountain Vista Agricultural Holdings. Elena studied the adjacent property, which she knew as the old Henderson Ranch, that had been sold after the family decided farming was no longer economically viable. The new owners had constructed several large buildings that she had assumed were modern agricultural facilities, though she had never seen much obvious farming activity on the property. "I know that property," Elena said. "The Henderson family owned it for 3 generations before selling it to out-of-state buyers. The new owners built some large buildings, but I've never seen much agricultural activity there. I assumed they were using it for cattle or hay storage." Dr. Thorne indicated specific features visible in the aerial photograph. According to Carlos's investigation, Mountain Vista Agricultural Holdings was purchased using funds that can be traced to the Cayman Islands accounts that received weapons trafficking profits. The buildings that appear to be agricultural facilities are actually storage and processing centers for evidence that needed to be kept secure and accessible, but far from government oversight. The revelation that her immediate neighbor was potentially involved in the conspiracy that had killed her brother forced Elena to reconsider every interaction she had with the property's new owners. She had met them briefly when they first arrived, introducing herself as a good neighbor and offering assistance with local knowledge about weather patterns, soil conditions, and regional agricultural practices. "I've met the people who bought the Henderson place," Elena said, trying to recall details from conversations that had seemed routine at the time. "A man named David Richardson and his wife Jennifer. They seemed like typical city people trying rural life. They were polite but not particularly social. I haven't seen much of them since they moved in." Dr. Thorne extracted another document from her collection, this one appearing to be an FBI surveillance report with photographs that showed the same David and Jennifer Richardson Elena had met, but in contexts that suggested activities far removed from agriculture. David Richardson is actually David Kozlov, a former military contractor with connections to several defense companies that hold Pentagon procurement contracts. His wife Jennifer is Jennifer Walsh, a financial analyst who specializes in offshore banking and international money transfers. Neither has any background in agriculture, and their Montana property serves as a storage and coordination facility for an operation that has been moving evidence and profits from illegal weapons sales for more than 4 years. Elena felt a growing sense of violation as she realized that people she had welcomed as neighbors were actually criminals who had chosen to locate their operation adjacent to her family's property because they needed the isolation and lack of scrutiny that rural Montana provided. "Are you telling me that my brother was killed because he discovered what my neighbors were doing?" "I'm telling you that your brother was killed because he had identified the Montana operation as a key component of the weapons trafficking conspiracy, and because he had documented evidence that could have exposed the entire network of people involved in the scheme," Dr. Thorne replied, her tone combining professional precision with obvious anger about the injustice Carlos had suffered. The older woman extracted one more item from the briefcase, a small digital device that looked like a sophisticated recording system. 3 days before his death, Carlos managed to transmit this recording to a secure server maintained by Defense Intelligence Agency investigators who were working to expose military corruption. The transmission was his insurance policy, meant to ensure that his evidence would survive even if something happened to him. Dr. Thorne activated the recording device, filling Elena's kitchen with the sound of her brother's voice for the first time since his final leave before deployment. Hearing Carlos speak again brought an immediate rush of grief and nostalgia, but his words quickly shifted Elena's emotional focus from personal loss to understanding the magnitude of what he had discovered. "This is Sergeant Carlos Vasquez," recording on March 28, 2019, at 0347 hours, from forward operating base Shank in Logar Province, Afghanistan. Carlos's voice carried the professional tone Elena remembered from his phone calls during deployment, but with underlying tension that suggested he understood the danger of what he was documenting. I have confirmed that the weapons diversions I've been investigating are part of a systematic operation involving collaboration between certain military procurement officials, defense contractors, and civilian businesses in the United States. The operation has been active for at least 3 years and has generated estimated profits exceeding $50 million through sales of American military equipment to Afghan militia groups with known Taliban connections. Elena listened to her brother's words with growing amazement at the scope and sophistication of what he had uncovered. Carlos had always been methodical and analytical, qualities that had served him well in his military intelligence role, but the investigation he was describing required investigative skills Elena hadn't known he possessed. I have documented evidence showing that profits from these weapons sales are being laundered through American businesses, including agricultural operations in Montana, Texas, and North Carolina. The Montana operation appears to be centered on a property adjacent to my family's vineyard in the Bitterroot Valley, purchased by individuals using false identities and funds that can be traced to offshore accounts receiving weapons trafficking proceeds. The recording continued with Carlos providing specific details about bank account numbers, shell company names, and coordination methods that painted a picture of criminal sophistication that challenged Elena's assumptions about military corruption. This wasn't opportunistic theft or bureaucratic incompetence, it was organized crime operating within the military procurement system. I have reason to believe that my investigation has been discovered by the people responsible for these operations. My communications are being monitored, my movements are being tracked, and I have received indirect warnings about the consequences of pursuing unauthorized investigations into sensitive military operations. Elena felt a chill as she recognized the fear underlying her brother's professional composure. Carlos had always been brave, sometimes recklessly so, but the recording revealed someone who understood that his pursuit of truth had put him in mortal danger. If something happens to me, this evidence needs to reach Defense Intelligence Agency investigators who are working to expose military corruption. The Montana operation is key to the entire conspiracy. If authorities can secure the evidence stored at that location, they can trace the financial network that connects weapons trafficking profits to specific individuals within the Pentagon procurement system. The recording ended with Carlos providing coordinates for the Montana property and detailed instructions for accessing the evidence storage facilities that had been constructed there under the cover of agricultural development. Dr. Thorne turned off the recording device, allowing silence to return to Elena's kitchen while both women processed the implications of what they had heard. Elena felt simultaneously proud of her brother's courage in pursuing dangerous truth, and devastated by the confirmation that his death had been preventable murder, rather than random wartime tragedy. Dr. Thorne, this recording proves that Carlos was investigating serious crimes, and that he was killed to prevent him from exposing them. Why hasn't the Defense Intelligence Agency acted on this evidence? The older woman's expression became grim with professional frustration that suggested systemic problems beyond individual cases of corruption. Because 2 days after Carlos transmitted this recording, the server it was stored on suffered what appeared to be a catastrophic technical failure that destroyed terabytes of sensitive intelligence information.
The failure was blamed on hardware malfunction, but technical analysis later revealed signs of deliberate sabotage by someone with high-level access to DIA computer systems. Elena was beginning to understand that the conspiracy Carlos had investigated extended beyond weapons trafficking into government agencies responsible for investigating government corruption, a closed loop that made conventional justice practically impossible. The only reason this evidence survived is that Carlos had also transmitted copies to a secondary server, maintained by a private intelligence contractor I was working with at the time. We kept the information secure while investigating the scope of the corruption, but progress was slow because we couldn't trust normal government channels. Dr. Thorne leaned forward, her expression intense with purpose that had driven her to risk her life reaching Elena during the storm. Elena, what I'm about to tell you will change your life in ways you cannot imagine, but you need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before you decide whether to help us finish what Carlos started. Dr. Thorne extracted the final set of documents from her briefcase, spreading them across Elena's kitchen table to create a comprehensive display of evidence that transformed the familiar domestic space into something resembling a war room. The papers, photographs, and digital records created a visual representation of criminal activity that spanned multiple countries, involved dozens of participants, and had generated profits that dwarfed Elena's conception of individual wealth. The weapons trafficking operation your brother investigated was just one component of a broader conspiracy involving the systematic exploitation of American military operations for private profit, Dr. Thorne explained, indicating an organizational chart that showed connections between military officials, defense contractors, and civilian businesses. The conspiracy includes fraudulent billing for military services, theft of equipment and supplies, illegal sales of military technology to foreign buyers, and money laundering through American businesses that were purchased specifically to hide criminal proceeds. Elena studied the organizational chart, noting names and connections that suggested coordination at levels of government and military hierarchy she had assumed were beyond corruption. The scope of what Dr. Thorne was describing challenged her fundamental assumptions about institutional integrity and national security oversight. According to Carlos's investigation and subsequent intelligence analysis, the conspiracy has generated estimated profits exceeding $200 million over the past 5 years, Dr. Thorne continued. These funds have been invested in American businesses, real estate developments, and offshore accounts that allow the participants to enjoy their criminal proceeds while maintaining respectable public profiles. The financial scale of what Dr. Thorne was describing far exceeded Elena's experience with business operations, but she could understand the basic concept of using legitimate businesses to hide illegitimate income. What shocked her was learning that such operations were being conducted by people entrusted with national security responsibilities.
The Montana operation that your brother identified serves multiple functions within this broader conspiracy, Dr. Thorne explained, pointing to photographs and documents that specifically related to the property adjacent to Elena's vineyard. It provides secure storage for evidence that could incriminate conspiracy participants, serves as a coordination center for money laundering activities, and offers a remote location where sensitive operations can be conducted without government oversight. Elena examined the evidence related to the Montana operation, recognizing geographical features and property boundaries that were part of her daily environment. Learning that criminal activities had been occurring within sight of her family's vineyard created a sense of violation that went beyond simple proximity to wrongdoing. Dr. Thorne, you've shown me evidence that proves my brother was investigating serious crimes and that he was killed to protect the people responsible. But why are you showing this to me rather than taking it to federal authorities who have the resources to act on it? The older woman's expression became complicated, reflecting frustration with institutional limitations that had prevented justice for more than 4 years. Because federal investigations of military corruption face obstacles that don't apply to civilian criminal cases. The people involved in this conspiracy have security clearances, government connections, and legal resources that allow them to delay, divert, and discredit official investigations. Dr. Thorne indicated specific documents that appeared to be official reports and correspondence between government agencies. 3 separate federal investigations of military procurement fraud have been initiated since Carlos's death. All 3 have been terminated due to insufficient evidence, jurisdictional complications, or national security considerations that prevented investigators from accessing critical information. Elena was beginning to understand that conventional law enforcement mechanisms were inadequate to address corruption that involved people with the authority to influence law enforcement operations. Carlos had died trying to expose criminals who possessed the institutional power to prevent their exposure through official channels. But there are other approaches to achieving justice when official channels have been compromised, Dr. Thorne continued, her tone shifting to something that suggested carefully considered alternatives to conventional solutions. Approaches that require civilian participation and accept greater personal risk in exchange for the possibility of genuine accountability. The older woman placed her hand on Carlos's recording device, as if drawing authority from Elena's brother's courage in pursuing dangerous truth. Elena, what I'm asking you to consider is helping us recover the evidence stored at the Montana facility, documenting the full scope of the conspiracy your brother identified, and ensuring that his sacrifice leads to justice for the people responsible for his death. Elena felt the weight of decision settling around her like the storm that had brought Dr. Thorne to her door. The choice Dr. Thorne was offering wasn't simply about pursuing justice for Carlos, it was about accepting responsibility for exposing corruption that had cost American lives and continued to threaten national security. What exactly would I need to do, Dr. Thorne smiled for the first time since opening the briefcase, the expression combining professional satisfaction with personal admiration for Elena's courage. Tomorrow morning you're going to discover that your neighbors aren't who they claim to be, that their property contains evidence of crimes that reach into the highest levels of government, and that finishing your brother's investigation will require resources, determination and courage that will test everything you believe about justice and family obligation. Outside Elena's kitchen windows, the storm had exhausted itself against the Montana mountains, leaving behind the kind of crystalline silence that follows violent weather. But inside her home, Elena could sense that a different kind of storm was building, one that would demand everything she had learned about survival, loyalty, and the price of truth in a world where some truths were protected by people willing to kill to keep them hidden. The briefcase that had nearly cost both women their lives contained evidence that could expose a conspiracy reaching into the Pentagon, but accessing that evidence would require Elena to risk everything her family had built over 5 generations. The choice between safety and justice was about to transform a struggling vineyard owner into something she had never imagined, becoming a civilian operative in a shadow war against corruption that had already claimed her brother's life. Elena sat quietly at her kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of government corruption that transformed her understanding of her brother's death, and challenged every assumption she had made about institutional integrity. The documents, photographs and recordings Dr. Thornton had shared painted a picture of systematic criminal activity that operated within the very systems designed to protect American interests and military personnel. The storm outside had ended, leaving behind the kind of profound silence that follows meteorological violence. But Elena could sense that the calm was temporary, that accepting Dr. Thorne's invitation to help expose the conspiracy would initiate a different kind of storm, one that would test her courage, resources and commitment to justice in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Dr. Thornton, what you're asking me to consider isn't just dangerous. It's potentially suicidal. If the people responsible for this conspiracy were willing to kill a trained soldier like Carlos, what makes you think a civilian vineyard owner could succeed where he failed? The older woman's expression reflected understanding of Elena's concerns while maintaining the kind of professional confidence that suggested carefully considered strategic planning. Because you have advantages that Carlos didn't possess, Elena. You have legitimate reasons to be interested in the adjacent property, you have community connections that provide cover for investigation activities, and most importantly, you have access to evidence that the conspiracy participants believe was destroyed with Carlos's death. Dr. Thornton gestured toward the documents spread across the kitchen table. The people responsible for this conspiracy think they're safe because they eliminated the primary investigator and destroyed the official evidence. They don't know that Carlos's intelligence survived, and they don't know that their Montana operation has been under surveillance by people with the resources to take action. Elena studied the organizational chart that showed connections between military officials, defense contractors, and civilian businesses, trying to understand how individual action could address corruption that involved dozens of participants across multiple institutions. But even if I could somehow gather additional evidence about the Montana operation, what would prevent the same institutional obstacles that have stopped federal investigations? How would exposing this conspiracy be any different than the previous attempts that failed? Dr. Thornton's smile carried implications that suggested approaches to justice that operated outside conventional legal frameworks. Because we're not planning to work through official channels that can be compromised by the people we're investigating. We're planning to document the conspiracy so thoroughly, with such irrefutable evidence, that public exposure will force accountability regardless of institutional resistance. The older woman extracted a small communication device from her briefcase, its sophisticated appearance suggesting technology beyond civilian commercial availability. Elena, what I haven't told you yet is that I'm not working alone in this investigation. There are others, former intelligence officers, investigative journalists, military personnel who knew and respected Carlos, who have been waiting for the opportunity to act on the evidence your brother died collecting. Elena felt simultaneously intrigued and terrified by the implications of what Dr. Thornton was suggesting. The prospect of working with professional investigators to expose the conspiracy that had killed Carlos offered the possibility of achieving justice that had seemed impossible through normal legal channels. If there are other people involved in this investigation, people with professional experience and resources, Why do you need my participation? What could I contribute that they cannot? Dr. Thornton leaned forward, her expression intense with purpose that had driven her to risk her life reaching Elena during the storm. Because the evidence stored at the Montana facility can only be accessed by someone who has legitimate reasons to be on that property, someone who won't attract suspicion from the people responsible for guarding it. You're not just Carlos's sister, you're their neighbor, someone who has natural reasons to visit the property and observe their activities. Elena was beginning to understand that her geographical proximity to the conspiracy's Montana operation made her uniquely valuable to any investigation that required covert access to secured facilities. But approaching that property with investigative intentions would put me in immediate danger. If these people killed Carlos to protect their operation, they wouldn't hesitate to kill me if they discovered what I was doing. Dr. Thornton nodded with acknowledgement of the risks Elena would face, which is why we've developed approaches that minimize exposure while maximizing intelligence gathering potential. You wouldn't be working alone, and you wouldn't be operating without professional support and security resources. The older woman activated her communication device, which immediately began displaying what appeared to be real-time satellite imagery of the Bitterroot Valley, focused on Elena's vineyard and the adjacent property where the conspiracy's Montana operation was based. Elena, what you're looking at is current surveillance of your area, provided by people with access to military and intelligence resources who have been monitoring the Montana operation while waiting for the opportunity to act. You would be part of a coordinated operation involving experienced professionals who understand the risks and have developed strategies to manage them. Elena studied the satellite imagery, recognizing her vineyard, the Henderson property that had been purchased by the conspiracy participants, and the geographic features that defined her daily environment. Seeing her familiar surroundings through military surveillance technology created a surreal sense of being drawn into a world of espionage and covert operations that seemed to belong in movies rather than rural Montana. The satellite display showed activity at the adjacent property that Elena hadn't been aware of: multiple vehicles, temporary structures, and what appeared to be systematic excavation work that suggested ongoing operations rather than simple agricultural use. They're still active, Elena observed, noting movement patterns and equipment deployments that indicated current rather than historical activity, which means they're still vulnerable to investigation and exposure, Dr. Thornton confirmed. And which means that acting now while they believe their security is intact provides the best opportunity to document their operations and gather evidence that cannot be denied or discredited. Elena felt the weight of decision pressing around her like atmospheric pressure before a storm. The choice Dr. Thornton was offering wasn't simply about personal justice for Carlos's death. It was about accepting responsibility for exposing corruption that continued to threaten American military personnel and national security interests. The familiar kitchen where she had grown up, learned family traditions and struggled with financial problems, seemed inadequate to contain the magnitude of what Dr. Thornton was proposing. But Elena could sense that this moment represented a crossroads between the life she had known and a future that would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed. If I agree to help you, what happens next, Dr. Thornton's smile reflected satisfaction with Elena's question, as if the phrasing indicated acceptance of responsibility rather than continued consideration of options. Tomorrow morning,
you're going to discover that your life as a struggling vineyard owner was actually preparation for becoming something much more important, a key operative in exposing military corruption that has cost American lives and betrayed the principles your brother died defending. The storm outside had ended, but Elena could sense that the calm was preparation for a different kind of tempest, one that would test everything she had learned about survival, loyalty, and the price of justice in a world where truth required courage that few people possessed.
At 9:15 a.m. on September 19th, Elena watched two unmarked vehicles approach her vineyard. Dr. Thorne had prepared her for this moment, but seeing professional operatives arrive at her family's property still felt surreal. The team leader, Marcus Webb, was a former Army Special Forces officer who had worked with Carlos in Afghanistan. Your brother was investigating systematic weapons trafficking that was getting American soldiers killed, he told Elena directly. We're here to finish what he started. Sarah Chen, a surveillance specialist, immediately began deploying high-tech equipment that transformed Elena's vineyard into a monitoring station. Through her sophisticated cameras and directional microphones, Elena could see the adjacent property with startling clarity for the first time. What she observed changed everything. The property Elena had known as the old Henderson Ranch was actually a sophisticated criminal logistics center. The buildings that appeared to be agricultural structures housed computer servers processing illegal financial transactions and secure storage facilities containing evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. Your neighbors aren't farmers, Chen explained, showing Elena real-time surveillance footage. David and Jennifer Richardson are actually David Kozlov and Jennifer Walsh military contractors running a money laundering operation worth over $400 million. Elena watched in shock as aircraft landed on a concealed runway that had been built using the property's World War II airstrip foundation. Planes arrived regularly from Nevada, Texas, and the Cayman Islands, carrying personnel, equipment, and evidence related to the weapons trafficking network that had killed Carlos. They chose this location because it's isolated, has aviation capabilities, and sits next to a respectable family vineyard that provides perfect cover, Webb explained. Your family's reputation has been protecting their criminal enterprise for 4 years. Dr. Thorne activated one final recording that Carlos had transmitted just hours before his death. His voice filled Elena's kitchen with information that explained everything. The Montana operation is the key to the entire conspiracy. Evidence stored there proves that at least 37 American deaths in Afghanistan were caused by equipment failures and intelligence compromises resulting from the weapons trafficking. If authorities can secure that facility, they can trace the financial network that connects illegal arms profits to specific individuals within the Pentagon. Elena learned that Carlos had discovered not just weapons trafficking, but systematic corruption that included fraudulent billing, equipment theft, and the exploitation of reconstruction contracts. The conspiracy participants had created an integrated criminal enterprise that generated profits by betraying American military personnel. Your brother died because he had identified the Montana facility as the conspiracy's most vulnerable point, Dr. Thorne explained. The evidence stored there could expose everyone involved, which is why they killed him to protect it. As the team continued their briefings, Sarah Chen's monitoring equipment detected unusual air traffic approaching the valley. We have an unscheduled military aircraft inbound, she announced, her voice tense with concern. Through binoculars, Elena watched a fighter jet circle the area twice before beginning its descent toward her vineyard's largest pasture. The aircraft's markings identified it as an F-16 Fighting Falcon, and it was clearly preparing to land on her property. "That's not part of the criminal operation," Webb stated grimly. "That's official military response. Someone with very high clearance just activated Elena's location as a priority site." Dr. Thorne's communication device suddenly came alive with encrypted messages. After a brief conversation, she turned to Elena with an expression of amazement and vindication. "Elena, the F-16 is carrying Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Pentagon's Internal Affairs Division. She's been investigating military corruption for 3 years, and Carlos's evidence has just provided her with the authorization she needed to act." The F-16 touched down in Elena's pasture with precision that suggested the pilot had specific intelligence about the vineyard's geography and the current situation. Colonel Hayes emerged from the aircraft in full military dress, accompanied by 2 federal investigators, and carrying legal documents that would change everything. "Miss Vasquez," Colonel Hayes announced, "I'm here to inform you that the evidence your brother collected has been authenticated by Pentagon investigators, and federal warrants have been issued for the arrest of 12 individuals involved in the weapons trafficking conspiracy that caused his death." Elena watched through Chen's surveillance equipment as federal agents simultaneously surrounded the adjacent property. David Kozlov and Jennifer Walsh were arrested while attempting to destroy computer servers containing financial records. Aircraft that had been preparing for departure were grounded by military security teams. "The operation your brother identified has been generating illegal profits by selling American weapons to Taliban forces," Colonel Hayes explained. "Those sales directly contributed to American casualties, including ambushes that killed soldiers using compromised intelligence and equipment failures that resulted from diverted supplies." Within hours, Elena's struggling vineyard had become the center of one of the largest military corruption investigations in American history. The evidence recovered from the adjacent facility provided proof of systematic criminal activities that had cost dozens of American lives and generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits. Colonel Hayes personally delivered the news that would change Elena's life forever. "Based on the evidence your brother collected and died protecting, Congress has authorized a victims' compensation fund for families affected by the weapons trafficking conspiracy. Your family qualifies for full restitution, including recovery of land that was fraudulently acquired using criminal proceeds." Elena learned that several properties in the Bitterroot Valley had been purchased using money from illegal arms sales, including parcels that had originally belonged to her great-grandfather before being lost to fraudulent foreclosure schemes connected to the conspiracy participants. "Your vineyard will not only survive, Miss Vasquez, it will be restored to its original boundaries and provided with resources to become a memorial to the American soldiers who died exposing this corruption," Colonel Hayes announced. 3 months later, Elena stood in her expanded vineyard watching construction crews build the Carlos Vasquez Memorial Center for Military Ethics, a facility that would train future soldiers to recognize and report corruption while honoring those who had died protecting American principles. The conspiracy's Montana operation had been completely dismantled. 12 military officials and defense contractors were serving federal prison sentences. The weapons trafficking network had been destroyed, and new oversight protocols were protecting American military personnel from similar betrayals. Dr. Thorne, who had been revealed as a Pentagon investigator working undercover to expose military corruption, visited Elena regularly to update her on related cases being prosecuted using Carlos's evidence. "Your brother's sacrifice saved countless American lives," Dr. Thorne told Elena. "The corruption he exposed was spreading throughout the military procurement system. By stopping it here, he prevented a cancer that would have cost many more soldiers their lives." Elena's vineyard prospered with the financial stability provided by the compensation fund and the renewed sense of purpose that came from honoring Carlos's memory. The Vasquez family legacy, which had seemed destined to end with foreclosure, had been transformed into something that would protect future generations of American soldiers. Elena often walked through the vineyard rows where Carlos had played as a child, reflecting on how his courage had transformed a struggling agricultural operation into something that would serve American military personnel for generations. The Memorial Center drew visitors from around the world who came to learn about the price of military corruption and the importance of ethical leadership. The storm that had brought Dr. Thorne to Elena's door had been the catalyst for exposing crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Carlos's investigation, preserved through his sister's courage to act on dangerous knowledge, had achieved justice for dozens of fallen soldiers and their families. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields but in places like this, Elena told visitors to the Memorial Center. "My brother understood that protecting America requires more than tactical excellence. It requires the courage to challenge corruption wherever it exists, regardless of the personal cost." The F-16 that had landed in Elena's pasture remained on display at the Memorial Center, a symbol of how truth and justice could triumph over even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies when ordinary citizens found the courage to act on their principles. Elena Vasquez had begun as a struggling vineyard owner facing foreclosure. She had become the guardian of a legacy that honored her brother's sacrifice while protecting future generations of American military personnel from the corruption that had cost Carlos his life. The vineyard that had nearly been lost to financial pressure now stood as proof that sometimes the greatest victories come from the courage to help strangers during storms, both meteorological and moral.